Well said, well said stuff. Even though these forces have been, hostile forces have been chipping away and eroding the values of our country, we're still the greatest place in the world. And God has still blessed us abundantly. I suspect when we look back from eternity, the reason for that will be because the Church of Christ is stronger in this country than anywhere else in the world. Amen. Do you think it was coincidental that right at the time this country was being founded, there were people who began talking about, let's go back to the Bible, go back behind denominationalism. And since that time, since the first century in the last 2,000 years, where has, with the exception perhaps of the first century, where has the Lord's church been the strongest? And from what location on this planet has Christian missions literally encircled the globe? Do you think that's all just happenstance and coincidental? I believe that this is all orchestrated by God, and that because the church is so strong, I mean, we've been weakened tremendously, have we not, over the last 50 years? But still, surely the Lord's people are the glue that's holding this country together and perhaps holding off God's well-deserved wrath upon us. So what do you want to do to help your country? Keep teaching people the gospel and try to convert as many as we can. That's the solution. It won't help for us to go to Washington and all of us stand out there and scream and holler and hold up signs and y'all are a bunch of idiots. And that's just not going to do it. But teaching people the gospel and living the gospel ourselves, not being hypocrites, is what we need to do. All right, let's hurry on. We were talking about self-preservation, whether or not defensive response to aggression is biblical, and I'm going to take you through some passages. Here's one example where we talked about the fact that this is not talking about a government, this is individuals after the flood, that it is appropriate to shed the blood of a person who has illegally shed someone else's blood. So the implications are human life is precious. God mandates the ultimate penalty for taking life. If you have taken someone's life, then it's only appropriate for other humans to implement the penalty that God requires. God requires measures to be taken to protect life. Turn to Genesis 14, where Abram, you remember, hears about his nephew Lot being attacked and captured and a lot of his retinue carried off. And so Abraham arms 318 of his trained servants and goes in hot pursuit and commences an attack. And, you know, the Bible many times doesn't give us the detail. But don't you know there was a lot of blood shed that day? There were a lot of people killed. Well, how do you know God approved of that? Well, when he returned, Melchizedek, king of Salem, who was a priest of whom? Baal? No, he's a priest of God. Blessed him, and even said, that's who's delivered your enemies into your hand. God did that for you. Well, that's an endorsement then, is it not? Of defensive warfare. God was not displeased with that defensive, though violent, response to aggressors. What about under the law of Moses? If a thief is found breaking in and he's struck so that he dies, there is no guilt for his bloodshed. So you wake up, somebody's in your house, a scuffle ensues and you kill that person, as unpleasant as that would be, and as much as you would not want to take that person's life, it's not sinful. I suspect that what's going on here is at night you wouldn't be able to recognize this person. What is their intention? And so it could result in killing the person. If it were daylight, though, and this person is not trying to murder or anything like that, then that would be a different situation. In either case, it would take an investigation. We would call that some sort of a police investigation to determine what happened here and who was guilty and so forth. But again, the taking of life did not mean that you were automatically in the wrong. What about the occasion where Saul failed to do what he was supposed to do when he was sent to Amalek to destroy both the king and destroy the population and destroy the animals? Well, he spared the king's life. God was not happy with that one bit. And his prophet Samuel told Saul that, and then took a sword and literally hacked the guy to death right there. Again, not a pleasant thought, but we've got to adjust our sensibilities to match God's. And God had no problem with that, and in fact required it. What about Nehemiah in chapter 4, where they are trying to rebuild Jerusalem, and there are some locals that are trying to frustrate those efforts and physically try to prevent it. And so there's this incredible description here about how these Jews had to take their swords and spears and bows, all implements of war, of killing, and remember the Lord, great, awesome, fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And then you proceed on, and half of them have their spears, shields, and bows in their armor. And so here they are with one hand, they're working at construction, and with the other, a weapon. So they got a weapon in one, a sword in one hand, and a trowel in the other. They're trying to work, but they're also trying to defend themselves. They're not out trying to take somebody else's country or somebody else's land or somebody else's property. This is all defensive in its impact and effort. And notice, our God will fight for us. The climax of the book of Esther, you remember that story well. We don't dwell much on the very end of it. This decree had been made by Persian law. There was no way to recall the decree. Even the king himself could not recall it. So very cleverly, they made an alternative decree to try to offset that one. And when the day came, then the Jews responded to all of those aggressive efforts by fighting. And all of that is approved by God whenever they defeated the enemies who were trying to defeat them. That's divinely approved defensive warfare. Okay, but that's Old Testament. Has God changed on this in the New? Well, in Matthew chapter 24, where it's beyond the description of the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's moved into the discussion of the second coming. And he says, watch, you don't know what hour the Lord's coming. Know this, if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would have come, he would have watched. He would not have allowed his house to be broken into. Well, how do you prevent that? Lock the doors? Yeah, but if they break in, what do you do about it? Well, the Lord doesn't get specific, but whatever measures would be necessary to stop the thief, he's implicitly endorsing. What about the implication here in John 18 when he's before Pilate? And Pilate's trying to ascertain, are you going to be involved here in some sort of military activity? Are you trying to overthrow our government? Are you trying to engage in actual fighting here? No. Well, why? Well, because my kingdom's not of this world. Now, if it were, then yeah, we would. My disciples would fight. Do you get that? That's what he's saying. It would be appropriate under certain circumstances for my disciples to fight. Not under this one. Why? Because it's not right to engage in defensive warfare? No. Because what's going on here has to do with me offering myself as an atonement for sin. That's made this situation different. Do you remember when Paul struck Elymas blind? Was that Christian behavior? Is that appropriate? It absolutely was. You know what's astounding to me about this incident? This Roman proconsul, Sergius Paulus, he's being influenced by this Elymas, who's this sorcerer, false Jewish prophet, and he's listening to this. And so Paul strikes the guy blind, and Sergius Paulus sees that. And then the text says that he responded positively to the preaching of the gospel, and then it says, being astonished, and you would expect it to say, at this incredible miracle that he just saw, this guy being struck blind. No, being astonished, look at it in Acts 13. Astonished at the doctrine of the Lord. See, miracles throughout the Bible have the same purpose, to confirm the word. When he saw this miraculous supernatural act, then that made the preaching that Paul was doing attractive and confirmed to be the word of deity. That's what astonished him. And then moving to the Hebrews account of this great faith chapter. You remember it? How they, through faith, subdued kingdoms, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong and became valiant in battle. So was it wrong for the faithful to subdue kingdoms and be valiant in battle and turn to flight the armies of enemies? No, it was not. So the strong biblical ban on murder is distinct from taking life in self-defense, capital punishment, or defensive warfare. Defensive warfare is the application of the principle of personal self-defense to nations. Defensive warfare is the application of the principle of capital punishment to the extended scale of nations. Look at these passages by comparison. This is in, you remember Matthew 26, where the disciples, specifically Peter, pulls his sword out whenever the Jewish military, the Jewish guards, and then there's a large Jewish crowd there that were not part of the guard. They all come to arrest Jesus, and you know, Peter, man, he's ready to fight. He pulls out his sword and swings at the high priest's servant, obviously not aiming for his ear. And do you remember what Jesus said? Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Now, for most of my life, I thought that meant, okay then, you're not going to be involved in using a sword or a gun or whatever. That's just, he's saying don't do that, because you do that, then you deserve to be shot. Well, I kept studying and found out that's not what he was saying at all. Let's compare that with some other passages. Remember back there in Genesis 9? Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. So you might read that and think, okay, so under no circumstances are you ever to shed anyone's blood. But we've already seen that capital punishment was prominent under God's law for Moses. Blood was to be shed by divine command. So let's keep looking. Go to Revelation 13:10. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. When you look at all three of these contexts, here's what is going on. When he said, whoever sheds man's blood, all who take the sword, he who kills, he's talking about those who take a weapon and misuse it by doing something unlawful. He's talking about what, like robbers do, and these people that break into someone's house and shoot the people. That's a person who lives by the sword. Well, those people therefore must die by the sword. They have misused their human rights, and they have infringed upon the inalienable rights of others, and they have unlawfully, illicitly taken life, and therefore they deserve to have the same thing done to them by God's decree. So, these phrases refer to the criminal's unlawful use of violence. These phrases are referring to what should be the outcome of those who misuse the sword. They will need to perish by a legitimate, divinely approved form of violence. I believe that's what's going on in those passages. You study those and study it yourself. Leviticus 24, whoever kills any man will surely be put to death. So if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword, or at least you ought to. So take all those passages, put them together, do your own study. Here are some applications today. What if an armed robber comes out of the bank and the police arrive on the scene? Do they have the right to shoot that person? An armed gunman? Yeah. Okay. You live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. That passage applies to that exactly. If a murderer receives a lethal injection, see the liberal element, they lather this up. Oh, it's barbaric. They get around the prison and march and fuss, and the mother of whoever's going to be executed, who probably is the reason why her son's in that undisciplined condition, but she's out there, oh, don't kill my boy. Well, and they say that's barbaric for you to kill a person and you're doing it because he killed. That's not illogical. That's perfectly legitimate. When you understand a righteous God who levies appropriate, infinite, perfect justice and wrath under the circumstances, by the way, that only he can tell us about. You and I don't have enough sense to sort all this out. I wouldn't know what crime's worth the death penalty, if any of them are, and which ones are not worth the death penalty. God would have to tell us that. Now, it so happens once you pore over and study it, it fits hand in glove with the human mind that has been unencumbered by error and falsehood. When you allow your mind to be nurtured and shaped by God's thinking because you're made in His image, then your mind has the capability of thinking like Him and seeing that this is self-evidently, obviously the truth on the matter. By the way, isn't that how you came to the conclusion to even become a Christian? You had a bunch of people telling you, you don't have to be baptized. They're not just one church in the Bible. So what are you going to do? Just throw your hands up and say, yeah, we can't arrive at the truth on that. Oh, you can. And without bias, you pour over the New Testament, you find out, Jesus said He came to build His church. So does that mean all these different religious groups with different names, different doctrines? No. There is a church depicted on the pages of the New Testament that you can identify and understand exactly how it's supposed to function. And then you can distinguish that from what we see in the confused condition of Christendom. Can you not? Sure you can. And when someone says baptism is not for the remission of sins, after all, eis, the Greek preposition in 2 in Acts 2:38, is causal, and therefore that's saying that you're baptized because you've already been forgiven. Well, what do you do with that? Well, that forces us to dig deeper and see if their claim is true. And you can dig deeper and find out, it's not. That preposition doesn't have a causal use ever in the New Testament. It's always prospective, looking forward. So baptism is necessary in order for you to receive remission of sins and get into Christ's church. That's not hard to sort out. And the fact that there's a lot of, minds and Greek scholars and different people that disagree and differ with that doesn't mean you can't get through that thicket of confusion and get to the truth. I'm telling you, God has created us in such a way that we can arrive at the truth of any doctrine that God expects us to arrive at the truth on. Amen. We're not going to be held accountable for things we can't sort out. God hadn't told us everything. We don't have to know everything. When people say to you, oh, you Church Christ, but you think you know everything. No, we don't. But we are under obligation to know the things that God tells us we've got to know, and so are you. And we can. One of the currents that swept across our civilization and culture in the last 50 years is, well, you can't really know. There's no such thing as absolute truth. That was taught when I was in high school. They were spewing that stuff out then. Raised up a generation of baby boomers, and 2 generations since then that have bought into all that stuff. Everything's relative. Well, you got your truth, I've got my truth. That's a bunch of bunk. If they were to actually live life that way, they'd be dead. Oh, you say a car running into you at 50 miles an hour will kill you. Well, I don't. So I'm just going to walk out there in front of the car. If they really believed what they say they believe, they'd do something like that. But there is truth. You can know truth. We're living in a skeptical world. So when Jesus said, my servants would fight, He was endorsing that could be a situation where that's necessary to do. And they would have been authorized by God to do so. But because of God's redemptive scheme formulated in His mind in eternity, before He ever created the universe, Notice how Jesus put it here. He's telling the disciples, don't you think I could come up with 12 legions of angels to put an end to this whole thing and save me? Wouldn't be anything wrong with that as far as the legality of taking life. But then how are we going to complete what Scripture itself through the centuries has predicted and what God intended from eternity? So Jesus could have called upon divine assistance if it would have been appropriate to do so. But the divine purposes needed to be achieved. Same thing in Luke chapter 22. Lord, shall we strike with the sword? No, permit even this. Because of what's going on here. There's something much, the disciples didn't get it, did they? They didn't get it. Once he was put on the cross, they thought, well, that's the end of that. Let's go back to fishing. Well, they didn't understand, and that's why Jesus would have said, when they said we got 2 swords, that's enough. We're not engaging here in any sort of a defensive warfare. But 2 is good if that were to become a necessity. Timothy Dwight, who was the 8th president of Yale, appointed by Congress to serve as chaplain in the Connecticut Continental Brigade, served with distinction, sermons and songs that stirred the troops in a speech delivered in 1798, The Duty of Americans at the Present Crisis. Religion and liberty are the 2 great objects of defensive war. Religion and liberty are the meat and drink of the body politic. Withdraw one of them and it languishes, consumes, and dies. And by the way, notice how intellectually sophisticated these founders were. Now wait a minute. Don't we have the ultimate public school educational system in the world, in all of human history? And our kids come out and can't even read? And now what they come out with is all these liberal causes. And so they come out and they say, well, you know what? I don't know if I'm a man or a woman, and don't you dare pick one or the other. That would be racist. Even though every single cell in your body, think about that, every cell, every hair cell, every skin cell, every liver cell, every heart, every cell in your body is either male or female. A male doesn't have one female cell in his body, and vice versa. That is genetically fact. So if a male thinks he might be a female, where's the problem? It's not his body, so it's in his mind. And what's the biblical solution to that? The word is metanoeo, to repent. Change your thinking, get your mind right. Did your mother ever tell you that? You need to get your thinking straight. Well, that needs to be said all over our country. We are living in a time of spiritual insanity. And while we don't want to be unkind to anybody, don't want to laugh at anybody, don't want to mistreat, we ought to love these people. But we need to firmly tell them the truth, tell them God's view on this. From the very beginning, God created them male and female. And Adam and Eve went through no gender confusion. And if they had, God would have set them straight on the matter, because He created them that way. And it's ascertainable. And this will only further the confusion and de-evolution of our civilization. So, if indifference to either at any time, if we become indifferent about retaining our freedom or our Christian religion, the prevailing character of repeal, if that's what happens to our population, 1/2 of their motives to vigorous defense is lost, and the hopes of their enemies are proportionally increased. I believe there's a lot of Americans now, they would just sit back if our enemies came to take over our country. They're already infiltrating us. We know they're coming over the borders, right? All this is fact. And they're okay. They'd basically say, as you're being killed, well, oh, you shouldn't do this. I'm very compassionate. Look, I've allowed you to come into my country to kill me. I've read articles where they say that. They think that's morally superior, to invite your enemies to come in and lay down and say, okay, do what you want to me. That's not the God of the Bible. And look at this. Without religion, we may possibly retain the freedom of savages, bears, and wolves, but not the freedom of New England, which was really the freedom of America. If our religion were gone, our state of society would perish with it, and nothing would be left which would be even worth defending. Sad, sad. These are prophetic, aren't they? These men could not have looked down 2 centuries through time and anticipated. Here we are. But they said, here's where we will be if these conditions are not retained. All right, there's the inalienable rights that I called to your attention. Notice then what is not an inalienable right, even though there's unbelieving confusion about this. Much of the government is saying every American has a right to health care. That's a bunch of bunk. I'm sorry. It's not an inalienable right. Every time a tornado or hurricane or whatever, man, the media, if the president doesn't get down there, he's butchered, he's vilified in the media, and on it goes. And they all believe this is true. You don't think there were hurricanes and tornadoes in 1776? So what did they do about it? They sure didn't think the government had a job. Going just to World War II, they wouldn't have thought that. That's ridiculous. What are you talking about? I realized that FDR brought the government in and started all these social programs. That was really a violation of the founding of our country. So how did Americans handle it? Well, most of them were Christian in their orientation. What do Christians do whenever their fellow man is in need? And it all worked just fine. The government has stuck its nose in all kinds of things, and look how efficient they've been about all this. Oh, the government owes me a job. No, they don't. I can't tell you how many people I know that we work with needy elements in our society. And they are jealous that they don't have the job that other people have, make the money that other people have a car like other people have. And that's typical human beings. Never mind the fact that you made the decision back early in your life to drop out of school. I know a lot of them. They didn't want to sit there and go through all of it. They wanted to go out and, drink or do whatever they want to do. They want to sit in class and learn. And so they can't get a job. But they want to blame everybody and claim the government needs to provide me with all of this stuff. That is warped, unbiblical, ungodly thinking. And until Americans wake up and start teaching their fellow man, and our schools wake up and start teaching the truth on this stuff, then we're in trouble. And it's only going to get worse and worse. Government doesn't owe me a salary or even economic security. They sure don't owe me intelligence. They don't owe me a mate. Nobody owes you that. Now, you may be ugly enough that no woman will marry you, but it's not owed to you. Transportation, school supplies. We have a government program that provides diapers for mothers. So your tax dollars are paying for diapers. Did you know on your cell phone bill? Look at it closely. Go and look at it. There is a charge that you are receiving in order to give away free cell phones to other citizens. Now, you may choose to take your money and give away free cell phones. That's fine. That's your money. Remember how that was put next? Was it not your money? You could do that with it. But no government has a right to do that for 2 reasons. Number one, you didn't give your consent, and the government's supposed to be fulfilling the consent of the people. Number 2, that's not the purpose of government. We've always had churches and charity organizations that take care of all that kind of stuff. And the government never should have stuck its nose in it. It's illicit to do so, and it even violates what the Bible teaches on the matter, because God ordained government. I guess He has a right to tell us what it's supposed to do. On it goes. And see, because we're not teaching people, we're raising generations of people that are completely ignorant about this. And consequently, our government has become, as I said, just a money changer place, and whoever you can get in there to get the money that you want is what you ought to do. A right is not the same thing as a need, even a need or a want or a desire that you might have. And by the way, the founders would not necessarily be against a local government. So like, the city government of Bangs, the people can charge those politicians what to do with their tax monies. You can do that. But the federal government was never formed to be involved in any of that. They went out of their way to indicate that is not the case. All right, let's move quickly to our next one here. Let's put on some glasses. Which one are we on? 3? Yeah. Okay. We've looked at purpose of government, the punishment, proper punishment, source of civil law. Where does it come from? What are unalienable rights? Here were 8 of those. That's not all of them, by the way, but there's 8 of them. And then we pointed out that these other items are not inalienable rights, and nor are they a proper subject of concern for the federal government. Now, if the government is charged by its citizens to do certain things, the founders would say one of the main things is the military. Police, sheriff, and all that, yes, on the local level. But we've also got to have a means by which the country can be protected from our external enemies. Have you noticed for some reason over the last several years, the two parties have kind of coalesced into, one of them is very pro-military and one is not. And so when this group is in power, they take money away from the military and it gets down and it's not functional. And then the other one gets in and they build a military. Remember that? Well, see, that's not a matter of politics and opinion. We're going back to the founding of our country. What is the purpose of the federal government? They had better protect us from our external enemies. That's their number one job, as well as internal enemies. Well, then it only follows that you need to have a strong military. You've got to, especially with the way things are today. Look who's coming after us. When balloons fly over and it's our enemy engaged in surveillance and we don't really do anything about it? Look at the situation we're in. I'm telling you, most Americans prior to 1960, 1950, they wouldn't believe all this stuff we hear about daily in the news. They would not believe it. I think if our great-grandparents were alive and they found out the condition we're in, morally and spiritually, and religiously, I believe they would say, hang it up. It's over. It's over. No country can survive this. But we have the Lord, and His will be done. So if the purpose of government is to protect the people and secure their God-given unalienable rights, then the government should not devote itself to infringing on the property and lawful activities of the people. Both the founders and the Bible indicate the government intrusion must be kept to a minimum. Why? So that we can be left free to live our lives before God without government interference. The law of Moses provided the perfect approach to civil law. Why? It's the only one authored by God. It came from the mind of God. So you can't find anything in the law of Moses that is wrong or imperfect. Think about that. The Bible doesn't teach that the law of Moses was inferior. Or are you saying that laws that were created not by Moses or anybody else, but by God? God's never made a law that's inappropriate or inferior. But the law of Moses was never defined and intended by God to fulfill the ultimate need of human redemption. But that doesn't make it a bad law. Would you go out and kick your car because it can't fly you somewhere? It wasn't made to fly. The law of Moses was never intended to be the means by which human redemption would be achieved. So we've got to get our thinking straight about this. The law of Moses was perfect for what it was intended to do. Well, notice then, when the people before they clamored for a king, we had an arrangement in which God's will could be achieved. And He began with Moses, He moved to Joshua, and then they had the Shophatim, the judges that God selected in order to fulfill some form of leadership, but he retained he was the ultimate authority, the ultimate government official, shall we say, and so they lived under a theocratic republic, one nation under God. That sound like what we were supposed to be? Well, the more power that people entrust to the government, the more the government's going to encroach on your personal liberty. They're going to take more of your money. They're going to try to control more of your behavior. We've seen this in country after country after country where those forces get in control. And we have a clear biblical example of this, a pattern of this in 1 Samuel 8. Remember, whenever they clamored for a king and God said, okay, go give it to them, but tell them what's going to happen. We won't stop and read through all of this, but look at what I've underlined here. Talking about the king, okay? You want a king? All right, he's going to do this, he's going to do this, he's going to do this, he's going to take your daughters, he's going to take the best of your field, just right down the line. Here's what's going to happen. This is incremental government encroachment on your liberties, your freedom, and your unalienable rights. What happens when the citizens give up their, remember what the founders said? The citizens are supposed to govern themselves through their elected representatives. You don't keep control of them, you deserve what you get. The founders sought to free themselves from such control by enabling citizens to select their leaders and keep a tight rein on government. The Constitution was intended by the founders as the formal means of limiting the powers of the federal government. By the way, it says that. It comes right out and says it. It's not saying, okay, we're going to form a federal government and you all decide what you're supposed to do. No. They said, because see, a bunch of the founders said, we don't want a federal government. That's too much power centralized. So we want the Bill of Rights that will limit them and make sure that future generations don't think that means they can do all this stuff to us. It's like they predicted this. So you go read your Constitution, it says, okay, federal government can do this, and this, and that's it. We are so far beyond that, I don't know that we could ever go back. It spelled out the powers of the federal government and then said everything else to be decided, we want to keep that regionally in the different states and the little local towns. People there can decide whether they want to build a road. If they're tired of this dirt road with all the holes in it, that's up to the local community through their elected officials to decide whether to build a road, because they're going to have to pay for it. Isn't that good? That's simple. There's the statement in the Bill of Rights. We don't want there to be a misunderstanding and abuse of powers. So we're making this Bill of Rights in order to show the restrictions that we're placing on the federal government. The powers not delegated by the U.S. Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved for the states and the people. Let them decide how they want to be governed in those local areas. How many people know this? Constitution clearly intended to pinpoint and limit the powers of the federal government. Look what James Madison said among he and the two other fellows that wrote the Federalist Papers. The powers delegated by the Constitution to our feds, few and defined. Would you believe that today? They're into everything. Founders recognized the need to collect taxes, right, to carry out the few things that the federal government was supposed to do, but they didn't want it $1 collected from the people that was not legitimately to be used for those purposes. And I'm telling you, they would be shocked and displeased that the role of government's been expanded far beyond that. And they would be shocked that we are putting up with it. You know what Madison said? Years later, he wrote a letter and he said, it's hard to believe that what we've accomplished here, what we've achieved, was all started because of a 3 cent, he said pence, 3 pence tax. And then he said, you understand that's not what it was about, the money. It was I wonder if I put this here somewhere. It was the enormity of the issue comprised in that action. See, if they can take 3 pence from you, they can take your car and your house. Why not? It's the principle that has to be defended and clarified biblically. So their view of natural rights given by God, was that a man's property, the fruit of his own labors, was not to be taken from him except by his consent through his elected representatives. Question, do you feel like the IRS has taken more money from you than they should have? Okay, there you go. Do you feel the government's using your money then, turning around and using it for illicit purposes that you would never approve of? Okay. I'm sorry, but it's our own fault. If the central purpose of government is to protect citizens from both foreign and domestic thugs, enabling citizens to live free to pursue noble goals, then it's not the purpose of government to extract monies from the citizens and redistribute it to others. That's not its purpose. That's illicit and unacceptable. The central purpose of government today has shifted from securing the rights of citizens and protecting them from both foreign and domestic thugs. By the way, are you not more concerned about your safety than you've ever been in your lifetime? Now, maybe here in Bangs, you don't lock your doors, do you? Your parents and grandparents didn't, did they? Oh, we never lock our doors. Remember them saying that? I don't know anybody that lives that way now. In fact, we got sophisticated security systems on ours. What's the difference? Do you not see that our country has shifted away from what it was and that the government's not doing its job to squelch all of that? If we were using the death penalty and implementing proper law enforcement instead of running our police off, we could stop a lot of this. Whenever force enforcement is prominent, that reduces the criminal element. It keeps them more in check. We've just opened the door and said, do what you want. A host of people are in line to get their piece of the pie. I've run into Christian and over the years, one after the other. Oh, we got to elect this person. He's going to secure my Social Security, and he's going to help my union money, and he's blah, blah, blah. And I'm looking at this member of the church thinking, you have separated your Bible Christian life from your business work life. You can't do that. You don't even know the purpose. You just want to get somebody up there in order to get you to pad your pocketbook. What's the matter with you? Christians don't live their lives that way. What so many Americans no longer know or understand is that the reason America has been so economically prosperous. Do they even know? Why are they pouring into our country? They want the money. Why? Because they're not getting it where they are. They don't understand the reason is because we've had principles that the founders set into place that were biblical and were Christian. So as we lose our Christianity, you're going to see more poverty, more need, more confusion, because Christian principles is what enable us to maintain. And that includes the Christian work ethic. Is that on hard times? Concern for the aged and the infirm, local charitable organization, God's favor. This is all what made America great. Aren't these the very things that we're losing? All right, so what's your alternative? If we don't want a republic, we don't want Christian values permeating our civilization and our political institutions and our schools, then what do you want? Well, here's the alternatives that are on the planet. Let's just talk about one of them. It's the more popular one now. Do you know that these politicians who come right out and say, yeah, I'm a socialist and I think we should blah, blah, blah. Do you know 50 years ago that would have been the end of their political career? They wouldn't have had the nerve to ever say such a thing. The World War II generation fought wars over this. And now you can stand up there in these Ivy League schools that are completely infiltrated by all of this propaganda. And they come out of those schools and spouting socialism and they think they're great. And I guess half of America's like, yeah, that's right. Now, what do I care about socialism? Well, because it's an unbiblical ideology. It's contrary to the will of God. Let me try to prove it to you. First, let's define it. You can go to a wide variety of sources that try to zero in on this. It's like a lot of theories. There's diversity and variety to it. It's a way of organizing a society in which major industries are owned and controlled by the government rather than by individual people and companies. So yeah, you can't have companies operating on their own. The government needs to control that. Any of various economic political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. Number two, a system of society or group living in which there is no private property. That's a very big plank. A system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. A stage of society in Marxist theory transitional between capitalism and communism. See, there's where we're headed. Distinguished by unequal distribution of goods and pay according to work done. See, it's kind of a new spin on socialism. You get the government to increase taxes, and then the government takes it and redistributes it. So they're accomplishing the same thing without some sort of a coup like Fidel Castro did back in the 50s, where he takes over Cuba. And they don't have to do that. Just get people in office that can force the American people to do it. And that's exactly what's happening. All right, what are the premier socialist countries on earth today? You've heard about them in the news and you're familiar with them. There's a lot of them, but here's a few of them. Okay, how's things going in those countries? Let me just show you one. Cuba has mostly state-run economy, universal health care for everybody, government-paid education at all levels, a lot of social programs. Here's an article that is probably 10 years old or so. Over 2 million Cubans have left Cuba and come to the U.S. They've tried to come as fast as they can. The government's trying to stop a lot of them. This article talks about a city, Havana, that has been preserved in amber. General Motors dinosaurs of the 40s and 50s roam the plazas. Cubans have been forbidden to buy new cars. So you can find some nice 57 Chevys down there. I mean, they are taken care of and sharp. No new cars. The government decides that. See, freedom, that's what happens. It starts dissolving. A Cuban standard of living has deteriorated thanks to the communist government. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans live in substandard free housing. They line up to receive government rations of chicken, rice, and even sugar. One of our missionaries sent me a picture of a table that had the rice and the chicken that they allot to the citizens. The Postal Service is slow, expensive, and unreliable. You think ours is? Not anything like this. Home telephones are all but non-existent. Internet access severely restricted, mostly reserved for the government and tourist hotels. On the street, even a casual conversation can prompt Cubans' criticism of Fidel and the government. He's deceased now. The monthly rations are distributed in small neighborhood shops. People line up 10 or 15 deep for their allocation of beans, eggs, a chicken, coffee, and rice. I thought standing in line at Walmart was bad. We're blessed. Well-worn blackboards propped in the corners of the store guide family shopping and menu planning. Even toilet paper has to be rationed. Oh man, I want to move to Cuba. Don't you? Amazingly, Christians are, because they want to evangelize, try to help people. Here's Karl Marx. Been dead a long time, but he sure has exerted an incredible influence on our country. In his Communist Manifesto, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. Do you remember what Jesus said to in the parable of the 11th hour workers? We looked at this before. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish? See, this one parable is in direct conflict with socialism. Abolition of private property, that is a major feature. Whatever you think about the Black Lives Matter movement, the only point I want to make to you is that 2 of the 3 women that founded that, 2 of them, they say, are, this is her word, queer. And she was being interviewed on a black radio station. And the fella asked a great question. He's not hostile whatsoever. He was pro. He said, I don't really see that your movement has any sort of an ideological underpinnings that kind of informs your movement. She said, oh yeah, we do. Here's what she said. We do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. Have you heard that expression? We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on ideological theories. No bones about it. This movement is a Marxist movement, according to her. Do you see that Marxists, Nazis, Hitler worked this way too, communists, they all work the same way. They latch onto something that most people would agree with, like treatment of each other regardless of skin color. We all agree to that. That's Christian. That's not what this movement's about. It's a Marxist movement that's trying to achieve Marxist objectives. If our people are not educated, don't wake up. These are all the ways that Satan operates to fool people. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, any of you old enough to remember her? She and Reagan were really good friends. She went on a crusade, sees Britain, England, and Europe is far further down the line than us on all of this. She said, this isn't just about economic efficiency and prosperity. Above all, socialism, the problem is socialism itself in all of its incarnations, wherever and however it's applied, is morally corrupting, she said. What are you talking about? Well, let's look at some Bible principles. At least three. Number one, it promotes covetousness and greed. And you know that the Bible teaches that that is sinful, that God is opposed to that. Notice how you could take Exodus 20 and point out how people are envious and covet other people's cars and clothes and bank account and electric gadgets. And, you know, I deserve to have a phone too like yours. So I want the government to pay for it. Okay. There's socialism, and it grew right out of your covetous attitude. Number two, envy and jealousy. That's endemic to socialism. And you know the Bible teaches against that. Anything that fosters that is in and of itself wrong. And that's where confusion and every evil thing will crop up. Solomon made that point. All the toil and every skillful work of man is envied by his neighbor. Okay, that's going to happen when people don't want to work. Stealing. Socialism promotes stealing. What is stealing? To take the property of another without the right to do so or without the permission of the one you take it from. Well, you just get the government to be the go-between on that. Do you know one reason why robberies and home thefts are up? Is because we fostered the idea in people's minds that their fellow citizens owe them. And if the government doesn't work fast enough and get that achieved, well, what's the difference between waiting for the government and just going to your neighbors and taking it? They wouldn't see any difference between that. We've set ourselves up. You say, someone says, well, if the most, the economic system that is more focused on greed would be capitalism. No, it's not. We all have to make provision to eat and be clothed and have a roof over our head. So is any effort whatsoever designed to achieve that goal to be considered as greed and covetous? No. Capitalism is nothing more than an ambitious person rising above laziness and applying himself through legal means to support himself. So let's say you work hard at 2 jobs for 10 years. Save your money until you can start your own business. Let's say you go start a laundromat and you sacrifice and work. You get up early every morning before you open and you repair the machines, you clean. Okay, so you're greedy? Of course not. But someone would look at that, well, he owns a laundromat. He ought to give some of that to me. But you could own your own laundromat if you'll save for 10 years, get up every morning, work hard. Doesn't have anything to do with greed. It's not endemic to it. A person might be selfish. They may choose not take any of that money, give it to the Lord or help anybody. But it's not because of the capitalism. But you see, that is built into socialism by definition because it promotes greed and covetousness among those who expect to receive from others. It encourages jealousy by suggesting that the have-nots, I've heard the government, these politicians promoting this, they use this terminology. We need to shift some of the wealth from the haves to the have-nots. Why not just have the have-nots get the wealth the way the haves did? go to school, get a job, stop having children out of wedlock, get married. See, these are all Christian values that are waning in our civilization. But wait a minute, didn't the early Christians practice a kind of Christian socialism? I've heard members of the church say that. I'm among them in speaking out ignorantly before I go study the Bible. I'll admit to it. But we, of all people, need to go back and study things before we set into concrete in our minds some of our beliefs. That was not in chapter 2 and then in chapter 4. That's not a reference to socialism where a common stock is created and everybody's obligated to give it so that it can then be redistributed to those in need. The Jerusalem church was in fact a very unique situation. Here you had thousands of Jewish pilgrims come from all over the world, according to Acts 2:5, every nation under heaven. They're there for the dual festivals of Passover and Pentecost. So they brought provisions in order to be there for that period of time so that they could fulfill Jewish Mosaic requirements before they went back home to their home country. Well, they never dreamed on the day of Pentecost that they would hear the gospel and be converted, become Christians. Can you imagine that many of them did not want to immediately go back home? They were enjoying life in the kingdom, a whole new they never could have dreamed this was going to happen on that day. Well, the longer they stayed beyond their committed time, the more they were going to run out of the provisions that they had brought in order to survive the trip there and back. And that was the occasion that created the situation in which there was a need for some of the more local Jews in and around Jerusalem to sell some of their properties, get some of their goods, and to share them with these newly created fellow Christians. And so that's what they were doing. When Ananias and Sapphira were selling that property, that's not socialism. They were just trying to help those few newly made Christians that were there. Notice this, civil government's not involved in this. This is just Christians individually under the teaching of the apostles trying to help fellow Christians. And of course, you don't see any of this through the rest of the Bible. That wasn't intended to be some sort of a normative or formative means of raising funds. It wasn't. In the New Testament church, you have 1 Corinthians 16, everybody lays by and store. Notice poor and rich alike, all are to give of their means. And yet here we've had these government officials start pushing for this universal health care. And look at what Castro said about this. It is really incredible that 234 years after the Declaration of Independence, the government of that country, us, has approved medical attention for the majority of its citizens, something that Cuba was able to do a half a century ago. He was proud that we moved that much further towards socialism and the Marxist thinking of himself. Back at this time, our president was using buzz language that I suspect was not, it fell on deaf ears of Americans because we didn't know what he's talking about. He kept using the phrase redistributive justice and redistributive change. What does that mean? Income inequality. Well, if you go do the research, this is typical socialistic terminology. It means you're trying to equalize wealth ownership. You take away from the rich to bring up the poor to try to equalize everybody economically. Don't you think it's incredibly arrogant for a government to think they ought to do that and should do it? It's unbelievable. And it stomps on the rights of the citizens in the process. Taxation designed to move wealth from one group to another, frequently associated. If you go look this up in the dictionary, this is what it says. Here was this fellow that gathered all these kids around him at Halloween after they had gone out and gotten their candy. And he decided to apply these principles of redistributive justice. So he got all the kids lined up, looked at their bags, and the ones that had less candy, he began going to the ones that had more and redistributing it. Almost caused a riot. One kid said, "Dude, that's not cool." Upset child dressed as a baseball. It's not fun to take people's candy. This is my candy. I worked hard for it. Listen to that. I worked hard for it. But he's being penalized. Another little girl, Princess, dropped her jaw, as he dropped a handful of candy in another kid's bag, looked up to her parents in disbelief and near tears as if to demand they protest this injustice. Where's my parents? Why aren't they stepping in here? So one kid said, I'm going to call the police. No point in doing that. We've run all them off. Well, that's just an application of it. There was a teacher that announced to the class that waited until the test was taken. They took the test, and then he said, okay, he or she said, we're going to bring you F students up to a C and you A students down to a C. Well, they were not happy one bit. Then he gave them another test, and the ones that were making the high grades, they just backed off and didn't worry about it. And so when they equalized, everybody got like a D. You see, there's a practical application of the principles. God created human beings in his own image. And we understand the concept of justice and right. Even these kids did see it. Kids see it. And so if you want to get ahead in life, God has created an atmosphere in which you can do it. But you have to want to do it. You have to not want to freeload and get it from other people. You need to be independent. This is all godly. This is proper Christian thinking. By the way, this has already been tried. You realize all the way back in the late 1500s, early 17th century, these are kind of by the way, these were the forefathers of the founders. They viewed them as the forefathers and the founders. Came over on the Mayflower. William Bradford wrote a journal. Go online, you can download it free. Astounding. This is a famous painting that is in the Capitol. See this little rainbow? That represents God and his care over them. And here is, John Carver, all these prominent pilgrims that here they have an open Bible, they're having a prayer on board the Speedwell that left not from England. They'd fled England because of religious persecution, went to Holland, then from there they came to our shores. Here they are still on the Mayflower before they disembarked. They said, look, before we do this, we need to draw up really a government. How are we going to function together? Here is how that came out. All profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, and not the kind of trucking we're talking about, working, fishing, or any other means of any person or persons remains still in the common stock until the division. So we're going to get out on the land, and whatever you do to try to advance yourself, grow crops, go hunting, whatever, it's all going to be put in a common stock. And then all such persons that are of this colony are to have their meat, drink, apparel, and all provisions out of the common stock and good of the said colony. That was their rules. Drafted on board ship. That's socialism. How'd that work out? Starvation and failure. He records it. Starvation and failure. So they began to think how they might raise as much corn as they could. See, people don't want to do a lot of raising if somebody else would give it to them. And obtain a better crop than they had done, that they might not still thus languish in misery. At length, after much debate of things, the government, with the advice of the chiefest among them, gave way that they should set corn every man for his own particular, and in that regard trust to themselves. See, private property, independent. In all other things to go on in the general way as before, and so assign to every family a parcel of land according to the proportion of their number of that end, only for present use, but made no division for inheritance, and ranged all boys and youth under some family. If they didn't have a family, then they were assigned a family. This had very good success. For it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any other means the government or any other could use, and saved him a great deal of trouble and gave far better content. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would allege weakness and inability. Oh, I don't feel like going out there today. Whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny and oppression. So, you can't make them work. The experience that was had in this common course and condition, tried sundry years, and that amongst godly and sober men, may well evince the vanity of that conceit of Plato's and other ancients, applauded by some of later times, that the taking away of property and bringing in community into a commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong, or man of parts, had no more in division of victuals and clothing, than he that was weak and not able to do a quarter that the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men to be ranked and equalized in labors and food and clothes with the meaner and younger sort, meaner meaning the more common, thought it's some indignity and disrespect unto them. And the wives to be commanded to do service for other men as dressing their meat, washing their clothes. They deemed it a kind of slavery, neither could many husbands well brook it. The husband didn't like that either. Upon this point, all being to have alike and all to do alike, they thought themselves in the like condition, and one as good as another. And so, if it did not cut of those relations that God hath set amongst men, yet it did at least much diminish and take of the mutual respects that should be preserved among them, and would have been worse if they had been men of another condition. He says, it's not like these people were, low class and didn't care. These are upstanding, principled people. And yet this didn't work among them. They have Christian sensibilities, and it didn't work. Let none object this is men's corruption, Calvinism. And nothing to the course itself. I answer, seeing all men have this corruption in them, God in his wisdom saw another course fitter for them. It's just part of human nature, the way God created us. We understand the concept of justice. Intuitively, we understand it. And so after that, they flourished. Created the means by which they could carry out this, and it was in harmony with God's word. God wants men to share with each other and to assist the vulnerable, but he wants this done out of free will. Look at that, free will, not government coercion, exercised independently by each individual, not coerced by the government. Here's how that then happened, 1623. By this time harvest was come, and instead of famine, now God gave them plenty. And the face of things was changed to the rejoicing of the hearts of many, for which they blessed God. And the effect of their particular planning was well seen, for all had, one way and another, pretty well to bring the year about, and some of the abler sort and more industrious had to spare. So they made more than they needed, and sell to others, so as any general want or famine had not been amongst them since to this day. So America tried this at the beginning. And here we are, 200, 300 years later, and we're cycling back around and doing it again. Under the law of Moses, was there a government agency like the IRS? There was not. Did the Israelites pay taxes? They did. Remember now, this is God's thinking. The law of Moses enjoined a flat tax of 10% across the board for all citizens. Let's not stop and read that. Let's hurry on. Tithes consisted of produce, anything grown in the field, and firstborn animals. Well, what was the 10% tax used for? Well, Moses took it and redistributed it to those in need. No, he didn't. That would have violated their inalienable rights. Was it used for the citizens at large? Was it used for the poor? It was not. It was salary for the one tribal group that had no other means by which to make a living. Because instead of working like everybody else to make a living, their work was devoted to the religious, spiritual activities that God enjoined regarding the tabernacle and all of the priestly services. Somebody had to do that. That's work. You ever butchered an animal? Ladies, have you baked? Does that work? Imagine a husband coming in and there's these loaves of bread, smell good, and, well, what have you been doing today? No bread for you. They had to bake that bread. And a lot of activities. That's work. So God said, okay, your salary is going to come from the other tribal groups who have been given land allotments. See, the priests were not. They were given some, what do they call them, outer lands around the city, a little bit, not much. But their means of survival had to come from the funding provided by the Jews. And so far as I can tell, there was no government coercion there. If you didn't pay your 10%, God took note of it. But life went on. So it was in return for the work which they performed. Tithes were taken to the tabernacle or temple, turned over to the Levites, and distributed among them. Again, because they had no inheritance. He's talking about the land inheritance, the tribal land allotments that God had given. Instead, the Lord your God has chosen you out of all your tribes to stand and minister in the name of the Lord, him and his sons forever. Notice that everyone was required to pay tithes. For some citizens to pay taxes and others not, that would have been unjust. No one is so special that they should not pay their fair share. Do we have citizens that are not paying taxes? Everyone should participate in helping our country. The Levites were the recipients of the tithes, with one exception. Since they didn't have the tribal land allotment for which they could earn a living, the lack of land was the trade-off for receiving the tithes. So this arrangement does not violate the work of able-bodied people. If you can work, you need to be working. They were. That's exactly what they were doing. By the way, they had to pay tithes. The Levites had to pay taxes too. Required equally, by the way, from all citizens. Oh, well, you're poor, so you don't have to pay as much. 10%. Think about this, folks. See, you sit there, well, I had a person come up, well, you don't think the poor deserve some special breaks? With all the kindness I could say, no. Who planted that in your mind? Not God. Look at the census ransom. This was a tax that was to be paid by everybody. From 20 years old and above, everybody has to pay this. You know what it consisted of? Half a shekel. The rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less. There's God's thinking. You know, I've had members of the church with all this Max Lucado stuff act as if God was less loving than they are. You know, what goes with liberalism is this kind of superior, arrogant attitude of, well, you know, I'm more virtuous than you. You know, like you ban instruments from worship. Well, we're bigger than that. Oh, you're more loving than God? I'd say if they were honest, they'd say, yeah, he needs to come up to our level. The tithe was not a free will offering. It was a feature. It was the modern equivalent of taxes to pay Levi salaries. Now, there's God's thinking on that matter. Just because you're poor doesn't mean that you don't have to carry your fair share like everybody else. The rich did not have, do you not hear this constantly in the media? Oh, the rich need to pay their fair share. Right? They say that all the time. You need to be paying a lot more. See, those people don't know God. They're not studying their Bible. That's right down the line of Marxism. That's how they feel about the matter. One other very limited use. Every third year, God wanted money set aside in order to provide for four needy elements in society: the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. But look carefully at these. By stranger, that's their word for an immigrant, a foreigner. But we're not talking about illegal immigration. That's a different study which is covered in this book. I don't remember if we get to it. The fatherless is a truly fatherless person, no parents. The widow is a woman who is not a divorcee, but somebody who actually lost her husband. Remember, in the New Testament that's addressed, and she has to be at least 60 years old. So the American government was established to secure the God-given rights of citizens. The American government was never intended to be a charitable organization that provides citizens with financial assistance. Only God-fearing moral people should be elected to fill government posts, and all citizens should pay an equitable amount of taxes to provide only the necessary collective services for the good of the country. I don't know if we're going to get through all of this today, but let's take our break. It's 15 till, and I will assess and see what else I want to get to you before we break up. Thank you for listening, and I don't think I saw anybody nod their head, but the food sure should have caused that, shouldn't it?